No mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. He mihi mahana ki a koto, tēnā koto katoa. Welcome, friends. Ko Philip Fountain aho, and I'm a teacher here in the Religious Studies program at Victoria University of Wellington, Te Herenga Waka. It's a delight to have you here tonight, even in the midst of concerns about the novel coronavirus. In times such as these, it is important that we maintain good health practices. And so if you haven't done so already, do turn to those who are next to you and, in keeping with Jacinda Styles, greet them with your warmest East Coast wave. Tonight's lecture is brought to you by the St. John's Visiting Scholar Program, a partnership between Victoria University of Wellington and St. John's in the City Presbyterian Church. The aim of the program is to bring distinguished scholars of religion to New Zealand, to share their scholarship with the local academy in conversation with the broader public. It is a great pleasure to be able to thank St. John's for their generous support, foresight, and commitment to the Visiting Scholar Program. The decision to resource stimulating and provocative public discussions about religion is one that I wholeheartedly applaud. As a country, we need to find spaces to have challenging conversations about religion. Now, perhaps more than ever. It's a real gift to have the support of St. John's for the lecture tonight. Let me also slip in a little shout out to the organising committee for all their hard work, Reverend Alistair Lane from St. John's, Dr. Bronwyn Wood from the Wellington Faculty of Education, and especially my colleague in Religious Studies, the indomitable Geoffrey Troughton, the key architect behind all of this. Kia ora, guys. Loving your work. The Religious Studies program at Victoria University of Wellington is committed to the task of supporting public conversations about religion in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, in our 50th year, Religious Studies carries out outstanding research and teaching on religion. If this is something that you are interested in supporting, please do get in contact with us. We are currently launching new scholarships to support students through their studies, and we'd love to hear from you. Our speaker tonight is Pádraig Ó Tuama. Pádraig is a poet, theologian, and conflict mediator. A sucker for punishment, he is currently working towards his third degree in theology. He is the inaugural poet laureate of the On Being project and hosts the Poetry Unbound podcast. He was the former leader of the Corrymeela community, Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation organisation. His publications include 2 volumes of poetry, readings from the Book of Exile and Sorry for Your Troubles, a daily prayer book, and a memoir, In the Shelter, Finding a Home in the World. As those of us who have already had a chance to listen to Pádraig know, he is also a magical storyteller. Pádraig was due to deliver 2 public lectures tonight and tomorrow night, and also contribute to a poetry slam and a prayer workshop later in the week before visiting other parts of the country. However, COVID-19 has intervened, and Pádraig will soon be on a flight heading back home to Ireland, hopefully before all the airlines and the airports shut down. Tonight's lecture on stories of trouble and peace will therefore be his last public engagement in New Zealand. The lecture will be divided into 2 parts, telling the truth about power and the complicated art of reconciliation. We will have a short break in between the lectures and then have a chance for a Q&A after both of them are done. Pádraig, it's wonderful to have you here tonight. I'm so delighted that you were able to make it to New Zealand. We are all really looking forward to your stories, poems, and reflections.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out, and thank you for that warm introduction. Before we talk about stories of trouble and peace, I want to express my thanks also. I really want to thank Alistair Lane and the Church of St. John's in the city for the kind and warm welcome and the artistry, really, of the way that Alistair and Jeff and Philip have put together a programme that has had me looking forward to it for months and months and months. So I'll have to come back. So that was kind of a demand rather than a promise. I think we should be feeling sorry for the people who are like, oh God, we have to organise another version of this. But I really am enormously grateful. Thank you so much. And also in the midst of, at the beginning of the wave of things changing, may we all find the fortitude and the practice of the heart, as well as the practice of profound safety and protection of each other, as we look at the ways within which things that we thought were really important and are become less important in light of other things, for ourselves and for others. This is an art, a spiritual art, really, that the world is being put into. So, the overall theme for tonight is stories of trouble and peace. And then we're going to think in the first part about telling the truth about power. The best way that I know how to talk is to read poems and then to talk a little bit in between the poems. Most of them are depressing, so from time to time I'll say something funny in between, but only from time to time. I think, and the way I'm going to look at each one, each section, each lecture tonight is going to be split up into looking at the past, the present, and the future. I a few years ago, took a safari through the work of Emily Dickinson. It took me 2 years. I read all 1,775 of her poems. In the morning times, I'd get up early and I would read some work of hers. And it did feel a little bit like having about a litre of whiskey for the intellect. I too much and absolutely unsure about what I'm capable of doing afterwards. And if somebody said, and what happened while you were doing it? Like, I have no idea. It's very hard to recall once you've been taking a walk through the wild world of Emily Dickinson, 1830 to 1886. She said extraordinary things like, the soul has bandaged moments when she dances like a bomb abroad. Who wrote that in 1860? When she was edited in a way she didn't like, she only had 10 of her poems published. When she was edited in a way she didn't like, she wrote a poem where she says, amputate my freckled bosom. Who wrote that? And at one point, she's speaking about the bobolinks, a beautiful songbird. And she says, the bobolinks are gone, the rowdy of the meadow, and no one swaggers now but me. Who uses the word swagger for themselves today? She did then. So one of her obsessions is time. Not that she says one of my obsessions is time, but after having been taking a steady injection of her every day for 2 years, including her letters, which are magnificent, I began to realize that I was thinking about time, and I was like, why am I thinking about time all the time? And I was like, oh, I know, because Emily Dickinson writes things like, the past is such a curious creature. To look her in the face at transport may reward you, or a disgrace. She says things like that. And over and over again, time crops up in her work. And so, as a result of that, not as an homage to Emily Dickinson, but because I think she's onto something. We're going to think about questions about trouble and peace, about power and reconciliation and complicated arts in terms of the past, the present, and the future. And then my favourite bit is toward the end, where we'll have a chance to have some conversations. Mostly it's my own poems, but I have some poems of other people. Am I speaking loud enough? Can you hear me? Great. I'm starting off with a poem by the magnificent poet Lorna Goodison. Lorna Goodison has just finished a 3-year term as Poet Laureate of Jamaica. She has been writing for 40 years, trained initially as a painter, and her themes and work are overwhelming and wide-reaching. She writes about matriarchy in Jamaica. She writes brilliantly about all kinds of versions of religion, and her deepest brilliance is both about place as well as the long legacy of the war of colonization. And her book, Orakabessa, is a book where she, in person, went to visit many places and wrote from the point of view of those places, including places like this one, Spain, where the initial so-called explorers had come to the so-called New World. And here's a poem called Reporting Back to Queen Isabella from the book Orakabessa. Queen Isabella was of Isabella and Ferdinand, and Isabella was, she had a lisp, and because she had a lisp, they were trying to standardize Spanish as a particular dialect, as a way of determining empire in Spain, because obviously Spain is a place of kingdoms, not a kingdom, and dialects and languages. And so because she had a lisp, they decided that everybody should have a lisp. And that's why, I'm not making that up, that's why Spanish says Valencia rather than Valencia. So listen to this. Reporting back to Queen Isabella. This is Christopher Columbus coming back from his voyage. So, reporting back to Queen Isabella. When Don Cristobal returned to a hero's welcome, his caravels corked with treasures of the New World, he presented his findings, told of his great adventures to Queen Isabella, whose speech set the gold standard for her nation's language. When he came to Jamaica, he described it so: the fairest isle that eyes ever beheld. Then he balled up a big parchment, unclenched, and let it fall off a flat surface before it landed at her feet. There we were, massifs, high mountain ranges, expansive plains, deep valleys, one he'd christened for the Queen of Spain, overabundance of wood, over 100 rivers, food and fat pastures for Spanish horses, men and cattle, and, yes, Your Majesty, there were some people. When it comes to thinking about the past, as we think of telling the truth about power, I think it is impossible for our world to think about the past without having a language to speak today about the truth about the power of the last, I suppose, 400, 500 years of Christianist expansion across the globe. I call it Christianist deliberately. It's meant to be provocative, to not have an understanding of the way that hand-in-glove power, conquest, absolute entitlement to places that were already discovered and that were not part of any new world. They were part of the world that was as young and as old as the rest of the place. We cannot speak about today taking in mind borders, taking in mind languages that will never exist again, languages that have been forgotten, unless we are willing to tell the truth about the power of that. And not to use words like, oh, the age of exploration. It was an age of genocide. It was an age of entitlement. It was an age of war. These are the kinds of words we need to use. There is power in those. It's uncomfortable because we need to re-examine the stories of people in our families. Maybe a long time ago, maybe not such a long time ago, maybe my very own self. This is uncomfortable, but we demand it of other people, so why shouldn't we demand it of ourselves? This is the call to us. There's such extraordinary and exciting and wonderful and terrible detail in this poem. Don Cristobal returned to a hero's welcome, his caravel corked with treasures of the New World, his great adventures. And then he describes Jamaica as if the eyes are beholding it almost for the first time. It was already beheld, clearly. And then there's this balling up of a big sheet of parchment and rolling it across a table like it's the world falling off the edge of itself, which was presumably what that was like for people who were living there. Lorna Goodison's brilliant line, there we were. We. Who's the we? Massifs. I interviewed Lorna Goodison recently and she told me that that's a bit of a slang word, a patois word for like dude back home in Jamaica. So she's meaning massifs in terms of the geographical term, but it's coming across there as a little small way to slip in humanity. High mountain ranges, expansive plains, deep valleys, one he'd christened for the Queen of Spain, as if the valley didn't have a name of itself already. Overabundance of wood, over 100 rivers, food and fat pastures for Spanish horses, men and cattle. That list is such an important feature because Christopher Columbus couldn't have made that list by himself. Who's he with? What's the danger of participating, saying, I'm just an administrator, I was just counting rivers? Who had the time? How many people would it take to traverse Jamaica? I've been there. It's not small. To count that there were 100 separate rivers. Administration can be its own evil when you're not asking serious questions. And yes, Your Majesty, there were some people. Last word in this is people, an afterthought, almost falling off the edge of the poem. How do we understand this when it comes to telling the truth about power? Here's a poem from Ireland. My great-great-granddad, my granddad's granddad, was a young boy during the time of the famine, the famine in Ireland. We don't call it the potato famine because it wasn't. There was a potato blight, but there was plenty of food. 1 million people died in 3 years. The population from 1845 was 9.5 million. By 1880, it was 4 million. The Irish population has never recovered. And the whole time, Ireland was providing 60% of the beef and I think 70% of the corn that was feeding the island of Britain, which has a far higher population than the Irish population does. People who were soon about to die were still loading ships full of food to go off. There had been a request to close the ports. Very pertinent to think about that today, thinking of closing ports. But the answer came back from some politicians, not from the people of England. The people of England are good people. I've been there many times. But for some politicians, saying, if there are fewer Irish people at the end of this saga, so much the better. You can look it up. So my great-great-granddad, Irish speaker, West Cork, was being brought along to a soup kitchen by his parents, him and his brother. And some soup kitchens were run locally, some soup kitchens were run by volunteers, some soup kitchens were run in a way where if you became a Protestant, you could get soup. So hence in Ireland, some of the complication about Catholic Protestant, it's got nothing to do with God or purgatory or Mary, everything to do with the memory of this. Telling the truth about power is a painful thing. My great-great-granddad was, I think, 6, and he got lost in the crowd, obviously. It was huge crowds looking for food. Again, doesn't that make us think of today? And he never saw the rest of his family again. As far as we know, the entire part of his whole family was wiped out. And a Protestant family in the neighbourhood who didn't speak Irish found him and took him in and kept him for 5 years. Quite extraordinary. Apparently the dad of that family used to say to him, "You're clever, like let us put you through school right to the end." But he was desperate to find family. So he walked about 45 miles to Cork City, maybe a bit longer, 55, and got a job in a factory. And any day off he had, which presumably would have been irregular, he would walk as far west as he could, asking had anybody got news of his family. Apparently until the end of his life. That's the story in the family. Before he died, the local parish priest arranged for my great-great-granddad to make his confirmation, because obviously things like sacraments were forgotten, and during a time when such a population is dying and people are being buried in mass graves. So here's a little here's a little villanelle, anybody who's interested in poetry, called The Famine. It's actually called the Potato Famine, but the word potato is crossed out. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. My mother likes her peace and her diet magazines. My great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. At the heart of every famine is the scheming of the state to bring a people to their knees for the state's convenience. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. On the phone, an Englishwoman says the Irish are fixated with our stories of the past in a way that's quite obscene, but my great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. My auntie moved to England and learned how to translate between the way a people are and the way their history's been. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. There are proteins in our grass from forgotten famine graves. Some families fed on rotten grass, and my mother tells me my granddad's granddad was the only one who made it. His family had all starved, so he missed his confirmation. Decades later, a priest arranged it, didn't make a scene. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate, and my great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. For the last few years of Brexit, lots of Irish people have been speaking about the impact of Brexit on what is regularly by the BBC called the Irish border. And we like to remind them that it's a British border in Ireland. We didn't draw the damn thing. So I was speaking to somebody once and they said, "Oh, can't you just get over the past and your border? Like it's almost 100 years ago." And I was like, 2 days ago, I got a green card through the mail saying that I need to carry this with me if I'm ever driving across the border in case I'm stopped by somebody saying, "Are you insured to drive over here as opposed to there?" There's farmhouses through which the border runs. There's hundreds of miles of farmland where people will be keeping cattle on both sides of that farm. What are they supposed to do when jurisdictions are changed as a result of Brexit next year? We've no idea, because the changes are ideological. It's not because they're saying, we want better ones, these are crap, we want to improve it. They're saying, we want our ones, just because we want them ours. And Irish people are saying, you need to consider us. And they're like, stop going on about the past. And this has really put a huge strain on British-Irish relations over the last number of years, on governmental level and on family level. It has really put a strain, and it has really brought many surfaces about how Irish people find it fascinating that in our education system, we probably spend about 3 years of history learning about British history, and Britain's history curriculum doesn't spend a page on Ireland. So it's understandable that people are like, what are you going on about? Because somebody made a decision that doesn't have much about Ireland in the curriculum. What are we supposed to do about that? How do we find ways morally to tell stories about the past, because they will influence the way that the way that the present happens? Here's another story about power. I was part of a group of gay men. Well, actually, I wasn't part of a group of gay men. There was a group of gay men that used to meet for prayer meetings in Belfast, and I used to boycott it because I was like, for God's sake, there are no places for LGBT people to go for prayer. Why on earth is this just for gay men? So I was boycotting it, and presumably they were devastated. And then a friend of mine, this is many years ago, a friend of mine went along and wanted to go along because he had a crush on somebody who was there. It was all very exciting. And he didn't want to go by himself, so he asked would I go along to accompany him, and I had a crush on him, but I hadn't told him. So it was all like a theological love triangle. It was magnificent. Anyway, I went along to be morally supportive. Nothing ever happened between me and the friend, thank God. We're good friends still, much better. And we happened to be at the prayer meeting where they were deciding, will we or won't we invite the lesbians to join us? And somebody said, I've never met a lesbian. Does anybody know one? And I started to take notes because I thought, I think this might be an interesting conversation. And somebody said, I don't know any either. What are they like? As if you could ask that question. And then somebody said, I wonder if we could invite one to come and speak to us. And I found myself thinking of, if one were to invite, like, the most important lesbian, to come to speak to a group of gay men, like, to whom would one address the letter? What would her title be? And, like, where's the address for the Department of Lesbianism? So here's a poem called The Visit of the Queen of the Lesbians to the Gay Men's Prayer Group. My friend Gail did say to me at one point to go, look, Pádraig, of all the names that the chief lesbian would call herself, Queen is definitely not one of them. I've kept it in there to show my blind spots. So, the visit of the Queen of the Lesbians to the Gay Men's Prayer Group. When she came to visit, she said, don't ask me, I'm just a driver. When she came to visit, she said, questions reveal much about the secrets of the questioner. When she came to visit, she said, ask a better question, lads. She said, misogyny is no respecter of your homo-androcentric little whirlwinds. When she came to visit, she said, just because you don't want to screw us doesn't mean you don't screw us. So don't ask me to visit you. Answer your own queries. When she came to visit, she said, cook for us instead. That's what the Queen of the Lesbians said. People like that one. People like her. I like her. I suppose I say that because I think it's important for people to recognize that groups of people, like the men in that group were good men who had suffered terribly. Lots of people, when I got there, I realized why it was a group for men. Most of them were older men from very rural areas with an enormous amount to lose. If anybody knew, there was an extraordinary place of prayer and faith and reconciliation, Clonard Monastery in West Belfast, that hosted that group for years, made it very safe, absolute discreet. So I totally understood most of the men coming there. They'd come once a month. Some would drive over 100 miles to get there. Yeah, I 100% understand the need for safety. And I 100% understand the need to go. Just because you're in that kind of circumstance, it does not indemnify you from the possibility of being ignorant about another group of people upon whom you can also foist the very same thing that's being foisted on you unless you're careful. That's telling the truth about power. It's awful. One of the things, as we look to the present, that we try to think about is how do we name what's going on? How do we say, well, look, here's the reality about what's going on as we think about this? Telling the truth about power sometimes means to say, well, look, I'm just calling this for what it is. I can't say why it is or whether it's going to go away or how it's going to change, but I just want to name this. And I live in a jurisdiction that is in the problem of naming. What do you call the jurisdiction where Belfast is? You know? Sometimes I've been parts of a group of people and they've said, oh, it's just great to be here in the UK. And I'm like, all right, isn't that over there? And then other people would go, yeah, absolutely right. And when I say, you know, well, it's brilliant, welcome to Ireland, people are like, oh, I know that's over the border. And when I'm from Cork on the very south coast, and when I moved to Belfast, I thought, I'm moving a city, like, I'm not moving country, and I'm not a foreigner. But some people were very clear to say to me, oh, you most definitely are a foreigner, and we won't use your name. We won't call you Pádraig. We'll call you Patrick, because that's what we'll call you. And there's possibly no better way to insult an Irish speaker and a person with an Irish language name than to deliberately anglicise it, if you know the difference. Obviously, if you don't know the difference, it's an understandable mistake. But if you know the difference, to deliberately anglicise a name is a little echo of linguistic colonisation, as I'm sure you can understand. And there's questions over the last few years regarding Brexit about, well, will this speed up a process of a new Ireland? Will the border be changed somehow? Will we have a referendum at some point? And this is a serious question, one that I'll be really interested in. Thank God the rules of the Republic of Ireland, it'll have to be a cross-border referendum, obviously. The rules of the Republic of Ireland are unlike British ones. We have rules about referenda in the Republic of Ireland, so if there is a referendum, policies will have to be decided in advance rather than made up out of thin air afterwards. That's simply a difference in what's it called, constitutional setup. Britain has the most extraordinary and enviable and brilliant parliamentary process. Overwhelming. They should have used it for asking the questions. They didn't. They used referenda, for which they don't have a setup. This referendum isn't written into the constitution that's famously unwritten. And that's part of the problem. So, if there is a vote on a united Ireland, it'll have to be a serious, prepared for in advance one, because it'll have to pass the Irish laws. But the question for me, clear enough as I am about how I'd feel about it, the question for me is, will anyone die as we try to decide? Staying part of the UK, becoming part of a new federal Ireland? Will anyone be kneecapped? Will anyone be injured? How many is enough? Too much? Too few? So here's a poem designed to irritate everybody. It's called The Northern of Ireland, because some people call it Northern Ireland, some people call it the North. And so this is not a proposal of a new idea, it's a proposal of a bad idea. the northern of Ireland. It is both a dignity and a difficulty to live between these names, perceiving politics in the syntax of the state. And at the end of the day, the reality is that whether we change or whether we stay the same, these questions will remain. Who are we to be with one another? And how are we to be with one another? And what to do with all those memories of all those funerals? And what about those present whose past was blasted far beyond their future? I wake, you wake, she wakes, he wakes, they wake. We wake and take this troubled beauty forward. Part of the complication about trying to tell stories about power in the present is that it takes all kinds of safety. And for many years, Corrymeela has, I'll tell you a little bit more about Corrymeela later on, but Corrymeela has brought people together from different experiences of victimhood, different experiences of pain, different experiences too of being recruited into paramilitary organizations at a very young age. I think had anybody come to me when I was 13 and kind of told me stories that, got my adrenaline and testosterone going, I think I would have been delighted to have joined a group of people that said they wanted me. And then presumably at the age of 17, when some of those groups would say, well, the only way you can stay on past the age of 17 is if you murder somebody, I don't know that I'd have done any different to many people. I think I might have stayed. Who am I to say that I'd have been any different? It can be very difficult to bring people together, but that's what's really needed. So I've got 2 short poems here about that process. I've worked for years bringing groups of people together to talk about this, talk about experiences of victimhood, experiences of being shot at, being bereaved, being almost shot at, surviving when your friends didn't, being recruited, leaving, not leaving, being imprisoned, getting amnesty, not getting amnesty. Peace processes like the one we had in 1998, or a peace agreement, is the beginning of something. And what we need to recognize is that conflict theory says that a conflict takes as long to de-escalate as it took to escalate. And a very modest reading of the pain of British-Irish relations is 1921 at partition to 1998. So, about 80 years, roughly. And so really the best time to ask the question about whether the Irish peace process, British-Irish peace process has achieved much would be in around 2070 or late 2070s. And I think that's a really worthwhile thing to recognise. And I wish governments were good at saying, yeah, we're in the long 80-year stretch of this process of reparation, of peace, of negotiation, of ongoing commissions and engagement. And each successive government will improve a little bit, please God, on the previous ones. Some of them will critique each other, but if we think that that's the long ache we're stuck for, that wouldn't be a bad thing, rather than, we had that before. We even had a commemorative plaque put up. So, community groups are a lot better at recognising how long it'll take. Here's 2 poems called In the Beginning. In the beginning, the people lived in darkness, and the darkness overcame them. In the beginning, the people lived in darkness, and the darkness overcame them for a while. The people learned to cope, so they spoke little of the things that they'd hoped for. They learned to escape, so they took breathing breaks in the bathroom. The people lived in the here and now. They stayed here and now in corners previously unfound in 2-up, 2-down houses. The people learned to walk. The people stood and they survived. The people learned to live without the lives that had been taken. Their only choice was that they stand, and so they stood shaken. The people chose their crutches, carefully carved and chosen, a bit of drink, a bit of soap TV, a weekly visit to a friend's house for cups of tea and paracetamol. The people's throats were choked with lives that are not living, and the thing about it is that they have coped with things that they should not be roped with. The people are victorious. They can look you in the eye and size you up. Their hold on life is loose, and their embrace is tight. The people stood in darkness, and in it, they became their light. That poem is written as part of a process working with Corrymeela when I was poet in residence there with a woman, Susan McEwen, who curated extraordinary programs bringing people together from across Belfast. And part of my job was to write a poem based on the conversation that people had. And this was a kind of toward the end of a long process. And I'd come back the week after and say, here's the poem I wrote to reflect on last week. What do you think of it? And I was edited by people, some of whom were saying, oh, I've never read a poem, in the last 20 years. But the whole point was that it was people who were looking for an echo of their experience. Some of the edits were great. At one point, I read out a poem after a really tough week when people had been saying complicated, painful things. And I read a poem that I'd written. And I said, how does that seem? Does it sit right? And a magnificent woman said, it doesn't say fuck enough. So that's a great critique. So I amended the poem. I won't be reading it to you. As we think of the future when it comes to thinking of stories of trouble and peace and telling the truth to power, I suppose there's something I want to say is that I don't necessarily believe in the future. I hear people say regularly, the future is in the hands of our children. And I think that is one of the most profound abdications of responsibility, accountability, and power that people are allowed to get away with. It sounds really poetic, but I think if you're in a situation in public where you're saying that, I just think you're letting yourself off the hook. I think we need to find ways to say, I'm working, and I'm doing courageous things that I haven't tried before to see whether that will work, to see whether whatever future our children have is actually already made different by something that people with power and influence can use right now. And I think there's something important to recognize that the future doesn't exist yet. The past barely exists. All that exists is the moment of courage, and the moment when you might go, everything in me wants to respond in a predictable way. However, I'm going to try to respond in a way that's surprising, where the argument on the radio won't be the predictable dialogue that everybody could write down in advance, where instead we're going to say something new, something unexpected, and our debating partner will go, I don't have a rebuttal to that, because you just said something kind to me. Thank you. And then we can begin to think, what does serious public disagreement look like, instead of the performance of a silly public disagreement look like? So here's a few poems about the future. Where is it? Oh, they're in here. The first one is called Go to Hell, but it's gentler than its title. No, it's not. It's not in here. I'll read that in the next session because I've left it behind. The second one, I'll tell you why I wanted to talk about hell, though, because I think one of the things that we need to do in public moments is to name the hells that we've created and the hells that perhaps we've been responsible for. This is where the study of theology has been so helpful to me. I did a Vatican undergrad and was a pontifical, whatever, in theology, divinity, and I found myself overwhelmed and deeply, deeply interested in the question of hell, actually all my life, in poetry, through Dante's Inferno, as well as in questions to do with theology. As a gay man, I felt told that I was going to be going there, so I suppose I felt the need to do a little bit of advanced research, The Lonely Planet's Guide to Hell. And I found out some really interesting things when I began to read about it. The idea is that in Judaism, really, there isn't an understanding of hell or heaven, actually. The afterlife really came in when the Greeks started to come down. And especially then when there had been this hope after hope after hope dashed by successive empire that came through and took over the Levant. and people were thinking, when are we going to get to some kind of solace? And started to go, maybe it'll happen in some afterlife, some, as the French say, l'au-delà, the hereafter, that over there. And then, of course, people start to think, well, because the wicked are dying happy, well, maybe they're dying happy and then going somewhere pretty terrible. And the story of hell has changed over and over in Catholicism, never mind in any other version of Christianity, and never mind in many other religions. And I found myself looking at 20th century theology about hell, and extraordinarily Pope Benedict, a pope who doesn't like me very much, and who I don't like very much, although the film The Two Popes did help, fiction as it was. He wrote something fascinating about hell. He said, and this I think we must always remember is coming from a German who had seen horrific things in his country. He said, if we as Christians have an understanding that there can occasionally be realized on earth such a thing as the kingdom of heaven, we must also recognize that the 20th century alone teaches us that there can also be realized on earth such a thing as a kingdom of hell. And if that's the case, we must go with our abandoned brother into those places with the courage that he had. Now that's a theology that I found really interesting. And that's a theology that made me go, I have good reason for struggling with Benedict, but I also need to be careful not to totally lambast him, because he has changed my mind and given me something that I've held on to for years now as a result of that. And inasmuch as I might disagree with someone, I shouldn't try to disagree with them all the time, because then I'll miss out something serious. And we currently have a public platform between friends and between politicians where there is an understanding that if you begin to agree with or have compassion for or show some kind of sympathy other than the most basic kind of sympathy to somebody on the other side of your political or agenda platform, well, then you're a sellout. And perhaps you need to be extradited or exiled from your own community. What a limitation of the human project that we have. And so that's why I have a poem about hell that I'm not going to read to you, because I can't find it. Oh, I found it. That wasn't a setup. I'll read this and we'll finish. Go to hell. He is called to hell, this man. He is called to glory. He knows well those twisted ways and those who've lost their story. He is called to clay, this man. He is called to yearning. He has heard of hidden streams that heal those tired of burning. He's searching out those raised in hell. He wants to know the things they know. He believes in dreamland where the ragged people go. He is called to quiet now. He is called to silence. Squat down on the breaking ground with those who've swallowed violence. He is called to anguished thoughts. He is called to flowers, to find in hell's own lonely fury that which no flame devours. I saw him on the midway path. I saw he carried two things only. On his trip to hell, this man, he is called story.